Coercive control is an ongoing pattern of psychological, emotional, financial, or physical tactics used by a person to gain and maintain power, dominance, and total control over an intimate partner or family member, systematically stripping away their freedom, independence, and self-determination. Coercive control is not always legible to the people living inside it. It can be made of moments that seem too small to name alone. A nickname, a joke, a complaint about your family, a pressured decision about your body, your money, your future, your wedding, your time. But patterns have gravity. Over time, all those moments gather. They begin to swell. They begin to organize your life around someone else's reactions. And by the time you recognize the shape of it, you may already be carrying the relationship alone. The beginning of my relationship had intensity. There was affection, sex, shared projects, talk about a future, the kind of early fusion that can feel like being chosen after a long time of being misunderstood. I love you came quickly. There were stories about exes, all of them apparently irrational, difficult, unstable. There was a desire to be welcomed by my parents, a stated interest in building a life together. There were enough beautiful details to file the uncomfortable ones away as quirks, personality, stress, a bad day. That is part of why this kind of harm can be difficult to recognize. No one begins with a spreadsheet of red flags. You begin with context. You begin with hope. You begin with the reasonable human urge to interpret someone generously. Those quirks I tossed aside, the root cause, entitlement. The belief that one person's wants, comfort, anger, and preferences should set the terms of the relationship. That belief does not always announce itself through overt commands. It can surface in smaller negotiations. Whose preferences are treated as meaningful? Whose discomfort is called unreasonable? Whose knowledge is treated as suspect? Whose family is framed as a problem? In my case, it was present in places that were easy to minimize at first. He downplayed my knowledge of my own body and cycle. He pushed for a courthouse wedding when I wanted a forest ceremony. He was irritated by my parents. But in any isolated conflict can happen in a healthy relationship, right? The questions I learned too late. What happens to your reality when you disagree? Is there curiosity? Is there room? Does repair happen? Or does disagreement become evidence that you are difficult, dramatic, ungrateful, irrational, too much? Because that is where control begins to do its work. In a coercive relationship, words often become tools for rearranging reality. Last year, on my birthday weekend, there was a rupture. First big rupture. Later, the night was rewritten as a story about me being a mean drunk. I remember doubting my memory. I remember apologizing. I remember the terrible, destabilizing sensation of chasing clarity from someone who had already decided I was the problem. That is the part people may misunderstand about gaslighting and emotional invalidation. It is not always a theatrical declaration that something never happened. Sometimes it is a relentless recasting of what happened. You were hurt, but now you are starting a fight. You remember a pattern, but now you're bringing up the past. You are trying to resolve something, but now you're milking it. You are reacting to contempt, but now you're a drama queen who needs humble pie. You need to get your priorities straight. Those phrases do several things at once, right? They dismiss the content of what you are saying. They assign a negative identity to you for saying that. They relieve the other person of accountability. Those phrases turn repair into a character flaw in the person asking for it. That is not conflict resolution. That is narrative control. And when it happens enough, you start walking into every difficult conversation already prepared to defend your sanity. You begin editing your tone before you have even located your own feeling. You work harder to be understandable to the person who benefits from misunderstanding you. Coercive control can involve restrictions, intimidation, isolation, financial exploitation, monitoring, emotional abuse, and tactics that establish dominance even where physical violence is absent. Researchers describe it as a systematic pattern that restricts freedom and independence, often producing isolation and entrapment through financial, logistical, social, or emotional barriers. For me, one of the clearest parts of the pattern was labor. I carried the house, my house. The planning wasn't just my planning. The money wasn't just my money now. The dogs. I only had one dog and now I had two. The errands. Oh, the orders. The emotional temperature of the relationship. The transactional sex. And he could forget. He could forget basic responsibilities until they became mine by default. He could perform confusion. He could perform needs. He could carry something badly enough, inconsistently enough, or not at all, until doing it myself felt easier than dealing with the consequence of waiting for him. That is what people mean when they talk about weaponized incompetence and so much more. But it is not simply that a person lacks a skill. It is the repeated transfer of responsibility through failure, avoidance, delay, or strategic helplessness. The other person becomes the manager, the fixer, the reminder system, the contingency plan. You become infrastructure. In my relationship, I thought I had a partner, at least at first. I was financially independent. I did not need someone else's money to survive. But I was forced into a provider role under false pretenses, while still being scrutinized for my choices and expected to absorb the emotional consequences of his. There were half-truths about his financial situation, enough disclosure to create sympathy, enough ambiguity to keep the actual burden blurry. A struggle became framed as temporary, shared, being worked through for us and our future. Meanwhile, the costs landed where they always seem to land. Economic abuse can look like this. Economic abuse can include controlling access to money, refusing to share resources, interfering with work, creating financial dependence, or, in my case, exploiting a partner's financial resources. Emotional abuse and financial control often operate alongside one another because they both narrow a person's available choices. The financial piece was never only about dollars. It was about consent. It was about being maneuvered into obligations I had not agreed to carry, then being expected to treat the arrangement as an expression of love. There is a particular numbness that comes from chronic overwhelm, from all that, from everything. It's insidious. You do not realize that you're numb. You feel burdened, stressed, furious, sad, yet somehow disconnected from all of it. You are so busy preventing the next problem that you cannot see the total shape of the problem. You are keeping things functioning. That becomes your job. And survival is not always dramatic. It's just not. Sometimes survival looks like answering another text carefully, paying another bill, canceling another plan, wearing something less likely to provoke commentary, choosing the route through the day with the fewest opportunities for backlash. My world got smaller through tiny little things like outfits, plans, business opportunities, friends, the way I spoke, my parents, the work I did, the amount of joy I could have without fallout. The smaller your world becomes, the more difficult it is to trust your own assessment of what is happening. You don't believe me? I've been there. You are no longer making decisions from a wide field of possibilities. You are making decisions inside a narrowing corridor. The issue is not whether one argument, one forgotten task, one comment about money, one insult, or one pressured preference would independently satisfy a stranger's standard of proof. The issue is the system that those moments create. Who has freedom? Who carries the consequences? Who must anticipate the other person's response? You, or who, or he, or she, or who gets to define what happened? What happened? And inside that relationship, you don't know, even though you do know deep down inside. And that is the story. I had survived harmful dynamics before. I knew some of the vocabulary. I knew the red flags I had learned from a previous relationship. And heck, I'm a psychology enthusiast. I study. Why didn't I know? But come on. Abuse does not always introduce itself in a familiar voice like I thought it did. There were good days. There were promises. There were explanations that sounded believable while I was still living inside them. There were moments of affection that made the cruelty feel like an exception, a misunderstanding, something I had failed to navigate correctly. And it didn't feel like my ex. It felt different than anybody else that I was with, but it was the same playbook, different plays, you know? I did not recognize the pattern all at once, just like I didn't with the others, but it was different. And at the same time, it all came down to the same thing. I recognized it. I recognized all the patterns when I was already carrying the weight alone. Research reinforces why the patterns matter. In a study of 553 women who had recently experienced intimate partner violence, participants experiencing coercive control reported higher frequencies of psychological, physical, and sexual violence and higher danger scores than participants who had experienced intimate partner violence without coercive control. The researchers emphasized that coercive control can produce fear and danger even without physical violence. That is important for anyone listening who thinks their story may not count because it did not look a certain way from the outside. Honestly, I'm not downplaying physical violence. I'm just saying your story matters too. Just because you weren't hit physically doesn't mean you weren't hit spiritually, within yourself, without yourself, all around you. Harm is not downgraded because you kept going to work. It is not erased because you supported the household. It is not made harmless because there were tender moments or I love yous. It does not become mutual simply because you eventually reacted to being cornered, dismissed, depleted, or frightened. Context matters. Power matters. Patterns matter. If you are listening and pieces of this feel familiar, I want to offer you something more useful than a command or a neat answer. Start by paying attention to the ledger. What do you carry that should be shared? What topics are you no longer allowed to raise without punishment? What parts of yourself have gotten smaller? When something hurts, does the conversation move toward repair or toward your supposed defectiveness? Who benefits when you doubt your memory? Who benefits when you accept every explanation as sufficient? What would your life feel like if you stopped managing another adult's feelings, failures, money, responsibilities, and reputation? You do not have to prove your pain to deserve care. You do not need a perfectly narrated case file before you are allowed to tell the truth about what your body, your mind, your finances, and your life have been asked to endure. If you are in immediate danger, or you are afraid of how a partner may respond to separation, a local domestic violence advocate can help you make a safety plan tailored to your circumstances. The National Domestic Violence Hotline offers confidential support in the United States at 1-800-799-7233 by texting START to 88788. And you can go to their website and have an online chat. A safety plan is not an admission of a weakness, any weakness. It is a way of protecting your options. I used to think the most painful realization would be that somebody I loved had hurt me. It was not. The most painful realization was seeing how much of myself I had abandoned, trying to keep the peace with someone who was never interested in peace. He was interested in compliance. He was interested in access to my labor, my money, attention, flexibility, my benefit of the doubt, my willingness to explain away what I knew. And the moment I began to recognize that pattern, I began returning to myself. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who has been taught to distrust their own perception. Take care of yourself. Tell the truth somewhere safe. And remember, you are not alone. You are not a stupid idiot who should have known better. The abuse was never your fault.